Finishing the retopology represents a significant milestone in the process of creating a highly detailed model with Blender. And this milestone is transitioning from the dynamic topology initial sculpture into multi-res sculpting. Remember that dynamic topology does not handle really high resolution meshes that well, meaning millions of polygons, which we need in order to sculpt the pore level detail, fine wrinkles, moles, or scars, or any of those very small details. And we can only really accomplish that detail with multi-res sculpting, which is based on subdivision smoothing. And Blender just handles that much better. We can get into those millions of polygons in order to sculpt pore level detail. Now, as part of the transition, we've already noticed an issue with subdivision smoothing. If I move our retopology mesh off to the side and turn off wireframe, we've already seen that when we add a subdivision surface modifier, a lot of our details are smoothed out and kind of washed out, frankly. We saw it really bad with the ear, just how different it looks whenever we had that broad geometry around the helix. This obviously does not look the way we want it. It looks very different from our sculpture, but also things like the nasolabial fold, which is nice and tight in the sculpture, but very washed out in the retopology. The alar crease as well, very tight in the sculpture, very washed out in the smooth retopology. And thankfully, we do not have to accept that. We can salvage the detail from the sculpture and apply it to the multi-res version of our retopology. And so if I hit Alt-G to move this back to the original location, we can add a new modifier that will capture that detail, and it's called the shrink wrap modifier. So if I add that to the bottom, we have the subdivision surface modifier, which has already increased the geometry. And so with the shrink wrap, we can simply choose our target head. We can do that with the eyedropper, and you'll see the detail pop back into our retopology. And the higher we go in our subdivisions, namely the viewport, is what we will see applied to the shrink wrap. And so our details get even crisper. Now, I think a viewport level of 2 is a little too low. 3 seems really good. If I go to 4, I don't really see a huge difference in 4. So I think 4 is going to be a little too high. I want to find a sweet spot where it's enough geometry, but not going too high or too low. And so this looks really good, except for the obvious errors that we have involved. Remember, in our retopology, there are areas that we don't want to be shrinked, like the, let's see, if I go to local view on our mesh, we can see that the mouth cavity is being shrunken as well. Maybe we can see that in solid view a little bit better. And we do not want that to be shrunk. We don't want the bottom to be shrunk or the cavity that we created for the eyeball. Now, we're kind of getting contradictory visualizations because the shrink wrap, if I enable the edit cage to modifier result button, you can see exactly what it's doing. So thankfully, we have a vertex group option in the shrink wrap modifier, which allows us to isolate certain verts to not be shrunken. And that's what we're going to do next. We're going to disable the shrink wrap and subsurf modifier, and then go in edit mode. I'm going to select parts of our mesh that we do not want to shrink. So I'm going to hold Control, right click and drag out a lasso selection and select the bottom verts that close off the bust, and then jump over to our object data properties. And here we can create a vertex group, and we can call it no shrink. And then just selecting the verts is not enough. We need to assign them to this vertex group at a weight of 1. This is the influence. So you could, assign verts with only half influence, but we'll keep it simple in this case and just make them all full influence. And then next we'll move over to the mouth cavity. I'll select this edge loop, Control plus to grow the selection, and then decide where we want the influence to stop. And I think that this is where I want it to stop. This last edge loop could maybe shrink to the sculpture, but remember we manually placed these surfaces so it looked like the lips were closed. And I want to maintain that since that involved manual positioning. I don't want to trust the modifier to the shrink wrap to handle that well. So I'm just going to assign the mouth cavity now. Also the eyeball cavity. And also in this case, we manually placed some verts in that superior palpebral fold. With that manual placement, I do not want the shrink wrap modifier to ruin it. So I'm going to grow it out to this point, And then on the upper half of the eye, I'm going to leave those out of the shrink. But then these bottom ones, I'm going to deselect so they are part of the shrink. Because up until the rim of the eyelid, there's no reason why those shouldn't shrink to our sculpture. But as soon as we get into that fold where the upper eyelid kind of tucks back into the flesh or under that superior orbital fat, that can get very messy with the shrink wrap. Whoops, accidentally unselected some things. Let's just undo that. Okay, I think this is good. Maybe we can deselect these so they'll be part of the shrink. Okay, I think that's good. For the eye, let's assign that. And then finally, inside the ear, I don't want the canal verts. We had to manually place those, so let's not have that part of the shrink. And I believe that's it. Okay, so now when we jump into the modifier panel, we can re-enable subdivision surface, re-enable shrink wrap, and select our vertex group. Now remember, we made it no shrink. So we're actually getting the opposite effect. The reason we did that is there are far fewer verts that we do not want to shrink compared to the ones we want to shrink. Thankfully, there is a handy little invert function next to the vertex group selection. So we will invert the influence, and this is what I wanted to see. The bottom is nice and smooth. The mouth cavity also is not shrinking. The eye looks great. And the only remaining issue is the top of the helix. And the reason this is happening, if we tab into edit mode, remember that the broad geometry here ends up being a far cry from the sculpture, right? So the distance between them is too great, and the shrink wrap modifier is just sucking it to the wrong surface. So I'm going to enable the modifier in edit mode, and I want to select the faces that are causing the problems, okay? So it should be these right here. I can turn the modifier off just to make sure. All right, I want to select faces on the exterior of the helix. And basically what I want to do is hit Alt-S in edit mode to push them out, right? The further I push them out, the greater chance they have to snap to the correct surface. And I can dial in exactly how far they need to go by enabling the shrink wrap in edit mode, Alt-S and pushing it out until they snap quite well. All right, and then similarly on the other side, if we turn off the modifiers, I know it's kind of weird going back and forth between them, but this inside edge that defines kind of the concave scallop underneath the helix, this is also too close to the wrong surface. So I want to push that backward, kind of do the opposite of what we just did with the helix. Though now that I'm looking at this with fresh eyes, I feel like these diamonds right here are kind of purposeless. So I'm just going to merge these two together so we get rid of the diamond and I guess pretend like I never left them there in the first place. But I'm going to select this edge with Control click so it's the shortest path all the way to about here. All right, and then re-enable shrink wrap. And you can see how weird that edge gets once the modifier is enabled. So hitting Alt-S, and I want to go backward this time. And you'll see it start to clear up and the edge become a little bit more uniform. Okay, it's not perfect. Okay, this is a very funky mesh for shrink wrap, but these are all little artifacts that I can easily fix whenever we jump into sculpt mode. So this is a much cleaner shrink wrap operation, and it looks very much like our sculpture. So we are in a very good place, but it's all based on modifiers at this point. And now we can transition off of shrink wrap and subsurf and into multi-res. So the way we'll do this is I'm going to duplicate this mesh first. So Shift-D, duplicate it. And I don't want to move it anywhere. You can see that moving it creates real problems for the shrink wrap. So I will immediately right click so that we have a duplicate in the exact same place. You can see in the outliner, Retopo 02. And I am going to go to our object menu and convert to mesh. This will serve to collapse our modifier stack. And before you do that, you need to remember what level subdivision you left it at. Now we did it at 3, but before you collapse, before you convert, make sure you remember what value that was. Okay, so at this point we can move this off to the side and we have our subdivided shrink wrapped version next to our original, which we can get rid of the shrink wrap on the original and the subdivision surface but we want to apply the mirror. Okay, that's important because this one is applied, so this one also needs to have it applied. We will apply that, and next we can add the multi-resolution modifier. But we need to pause at an unfortunate point in this process because at this point in time when I'm recording this, I'm using 2.83, which is the first LTS version of Blender, the first long-term support version of Blender. However, if I add a multi-resolution modifier, you'll notice that we don't have a sculpt option because multi-res did not support sculpting temporarily in this version of Blender, but it did come back with Blender 2.9, which was released recently. So kind of awkwardly, I need to jump to 2.9 to deal with multi-resolution. All right, so I'm going to save a version of my scene with 283 at the end, representing the Blender version. And the reason I want to be mindful of the version is I don't want it to cause errors jumping back and forth. And frankly, I'm kind of figuring this out as I go. It's a little bit weird with Blender to have a long-term support version, which suggests, dependability, but also wanting to try the new tools in other versions of Blender, some of which, like multi-res, are crucial to this process. So I don't know, we'll figure it out as we go. But as I jump into multi-res, I want to use Blender 2.9, which I will launch now. And let's open that file we just saved, 2.83. And it looks like I did save it with the multi-res. Now, out of kind of suspicion, I don't know if this causes problems, I am going to remove it and add another one. I just don't want any of the data messing up between the versions. But you can tell here that we have a significantly different UI for our modifiers. All the same tools are still there, but we do have an additional one that I want to show you, because there's actually two ways to transfer the detail into the multi-resolution modifier. And the first way that's been there a long time is, since this mesh was subdivided at a level of 3, we can go to our multi-res mesh and subdivide also to a level of 3. And then in the shape options, we have this reshape button. So if I select our shrink wrapped version and then shift select our multi-res version and hit reshape, you'll see that the details pop over. And this is because both of these were subdivided according to Catmull-Clark subdivision. They share the same vertex count, vertex order, vertex indices, basically the exact same mesh data except for the vertex positions. And that's why we can transition those details. So that's option number 1. Option number 2 is actually selecting our shrink wrap version, which is at a level of 3 subdivisions away from the our base retopology. We can add a multi-resolution there. And in 2.9, it introduced a new option in the generate tools of the multi-res modifier called rebuild subdivisions. All right, so this allows us to unsubdivide back down to the base level. If we click that, it should just take a second, and it will rebuild our levels, which we'll see populated in a second when that finishes. All right, so we're at a level of 3, and we can jump down in, let's see, in the viewport. All right, you see that the detail goes down until we're back to our base retopology. Okay, so as far as I can tell, this is essentially doing the exact same thing 2 different ways. Either one should work out fine, but we have transitioned successfully into a multi-res format, right? We can jump, as you saw, up and down in the levels. Most importantly, jumping up the levels in sculpt mode to accomplish that fine detail sculpting, which we will do very soon. But first, before I forget, let's make sure to save a version of our scene with 2.9. Not 2.89, just 2.9, and we'll save it as version 2.